just heard from Frankie Edgar in our first interview, and we are going to keep it in the lightweight division, and another former champion here on In This Corner with Cyrus Fees, and it is the one and only Muscle Shark up in Minnesota. It is Sean Sherk. Sean Sherk, of course, a 10-year veteran of MMA, a former UFC world champion in the lightweight division. Of course, trained at and still affiliated with the Academy, the world-famous Academy there with Greg Nelson. And it is a pleasure to speak to Mr. Sean Sherk. Sean, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Not too bad. Not too bad. You know, just maintaining the best way that we can. I'm down here in Tennessee. You're up in Minnesota. I think we're both in pretty much hot spots when it comes to COVID. So a lot of regulations going on right now, which is why we have to talk via Zoom.
Yeah, it's been a crazy year, that's for sure.
No doubt. And, you know, staying on that for a second, how have you handled it? I know that you still train fighters. I know you're still involved. Obviously, you got the gym right behind you. How have you handled all the regulations and everything that's gone on in 2020?
You know, I just been taking it in stride. You know, I do real estate now. I flip houses. So there's been a lot of regulations on the real estate industry and the house flipping industry. So it's basically brought my business to a standstill. So I've just kind of been taking things in stride, you know, just kind of taking it in stride and you know, kind of all bets are off this year. I don't know what the rest of this year entails. I guess I'm looking forward to next year to get a fresh start. So I've been training. I've been at home a lot. They put a pause. I use the word pause because we don't know when our wrestling season's going to continue. Both of my boys wrestle. So they put a pause on our season and they halted my business. And that's just been a really strange year for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely understand that. And I think everybody's kind of been put in a tricky situation, to say the least. And, you know, hopefully things will kind of work themselves out. I know it's a hot market when it comes to real estate, but I can imagine things are tougher when you're trying to flip houses. But I know down here in Tennessee, I mean, gosh, houses are flying off the market right now, just because the interest rates are what they are. So people are going crazy.
Yeah, that is true. But me as an investor, I have to buy houses for flipping. So there's not a lot of inventory out there. That's where the problem takes place. There's no inventory, and that's the reason why things are selling so fast, because there's not a lot of stuff out there to buy.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, it's crazy. And we'll get into how you kind of made that transition. But I want to go all the way back, you know, kind of start in the beginning. Growing up St. Francis, Minnesota. Started I look at that. I felt like the Minnesota accent kind of like came with me when I said that. I said Minnesota and I didn't even mean to do it. Started wrestling really early. I think age 7 or something like that. Really early on. What's the childhood of the Muscle Shark look like?
Yeah, you know, wrestling was our family sport. So I was put in wrestling at 7 years old. I loved it. I felt like that was just something that was really fitting for what my body style and my body type, I guess. So I wrestled my whole life, and once I got out of, I did well, you know, did good as a wrestler. And once I got out of high school, I started training mixed martial arts pretty much almost instantly. Probably, I'd say about 1994, I started training mixed martial arts, and that's when I met Greg Nelson. Was right around that time.
Yeah, you know, in talking about that, you know, were there any other aspirations for you, like coming out of high school? I mean, was there something else you were looking forward to doing, or were you just like laser focused, like let's get into this and let's keep competing?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, when I got out of school, I had no idea what I was going to do. I was a plumber. I worked at a factory. I worked for built walk-in coolers, refrigeration systems, stuff like that. So I just was kind of all over the place. I guess I didn't really know what I wanted to do with myself. You know, I always had a love for competition. So always that draw where I could continue to compete and catch for about a year out of high school. And, you know, there was always that draw pull where I wanted to continue to compete, but there was really nowhere for me to compete. So I started training mixed martial arts in I believe it was 94 with Greg Nelson. And even at that point in time, there still wasn't a large market for to be a competitive fighter. I mean, the UFC was brand new. There was no weight classes. There was no organizations outside of the UFC. So it was real green and grassroots. And the reason why I started training mixed martial arts was for my love of competition and for my love of just being in shape and staying in the element of the fighting arts and wrestling and stuff like that. So it was kind of my outlet to continue wrestling. Even though I wasn't competing, I was still able to go to the gym on a regular basis and wrestle and learn some new stuff at the same time. So that's where it all started, was just me wanting to stay in shape and kind of stay involved in the sport. And then it kind of evolved from there.
Yeah, because once you get out of high school or even out of college, when it comes to amateur wrestling, there's not a whole lot of options to stay busy. So I totally get where you're coming from, and not coming that I was a serious athlete, but speaking to so many of you fighters and just to other athletes, it's hard to give up that competition and that rush. So I can only imagine that was kind of your mindset, that you had to keep that thing going.
Well, yeah, it's hard to I wrestled my whole life. So yeah, it's hard to just all of a sudden when you get out of high school say, okay, you're done now. That's it. What now? So it was a hard train. I was able to find and continue my love of competition from there.
No doubt. Well, you get started in 2001 and I look up and down your record and I'm seeing, let me put it this way. I've talked to so many fighters and I love hearing stories about the early days of MMA, especially like that early 2000s feel, 2000, 2001, when things were just crazy, especially with small shows. I mean, even now, small shows can be crazy and promoters can be absolutely bananas. Do you have any good stories about, I saw one Midwest Madness and some of these shows, man. What were some of those shows like? And you got any good stories?
In the early days, there was no rules. There was no regulations. There was no commissions involved. So every show was different. Every show, every promoter, they just kind of make up their own rules as they go. And I remember a funny story was my first fight. I fought in a show called Danger Zone, and that was a Dan Severn's show, and that was in Minnesota. So it was an 8-man tournament, which you don't see. You fight 3 times in one night, and back in the early days, that was a normal thing. So 8-man tournament, and the gloves I ordered from Dave, remember that name? And they had these homemade gloves that he used, that he made himself, and they were nothing but a piece of leather. He made some kind of hang where you slide your hands into a piece of adding nothing, just a pair of leather that fit over your hands. And him, myself, and John Rankin all wore the same gloves throughout the night. So I fought first. I wore the gloves, won my fight, took the gloves off. I gave them to Dave. He wore them, took them off, gave them back to me. I fought, gave them to John Rankin. He wore them. Then I wore them again for my final fight. So by the end of the night, these gloves were just filled with sweat and blood and hair and everything else you can possibly imagine. And I used the word gloves loosely because, like I said, it was nothing but just a thin piece of leather that barely covered over the knuckles right there. So wow. I used those gloves for probably my first 5 or 6 mixed martial arts fights. And after that, I was told by Monty Cox, he was one of the big promoters here in the Midwest. He says, we're going to have to retire those gloves now, because between me, myself, and John Rankin, that's all we ever wore. So he says, we're going to have to retire those gloves. They've done their purpose, and it's time to put those away and start wearing some real gloves now.
That's funny, man. Yeah, it's an awesome story. And I've heard that a number of times, the sharing gloves thing. And it's something that seems so crazy now, but it was just normal back then. Yeah, I love hearing about that. And we actually had Monty on the program, and what an awesome guy. What a character for sure. Such a big part of the fabric of MMA back then, Monty Cox, to say the least. I got to ask, I looked up and down, and you're running this incredible streak early on. You run in and the streak continues, but Karo Parysian, man, loved watching that guy fight. Just a fantastic fighter, very exciting. Talk about the fights with Parysian, because from what I could see, that was a big step up in competition, getting to fight Karo, and talk about those couple fights you had with him.
The first time I fought Karo was I believe it was in St. Louis. It was another tournament, an 8-man tournament. So in that tournament, we had myself, Shoney Carter, Karo Parysian, Chris Brennan, Steve Berger. 8-man tournament. You have 5 names right there who all eventually were ranked, world ranked. At this time, we weren't. We were all in the earlier mid stages of our career. But you have an 8-man tournament with 5 guys like that in there, and a random draw. So my first fight was against Karo Parysian, who I had no idea who he was, and he had no idea who I was, and we ended up fighting. It was about a 20-minute fight. It went to overtime, and I won a split decision. So that was a tough fight. And I remember talking to him after the fight was over, and we have completely different contrasting body styles. And I remember him telling me after the fight was over, he was in my room and we were hanging out, and he says to me, he goes, I was looking at you across the ring, and he goes, I saw all these muscles, and I thought to myself, this guy's going to get tired in the first round. I'll submit him, And I'm looking at him thinking the exact opposite. This guy, he kind of looked out of shape to me. He just doesn't have that body style.
Yeah.
And looking at him thinking this guy's pretty out of shape. I'll tire him out in the first round and I'll finish him in the second. Well, 20 minutes later, neither of us were tired and we were still throwing for the fences. So that was a tough fight. That was probably one of the toughest fights I've had, throughout my career. And I think we were both undefeated at that time too. I believe I was 10-0, and he might have been 8-0 at that time. So I handed him his first loss, and we ended up having a rematch. I think it was probably about 3 months after that.
Yeah. Yeah. Just a great fighter. And it's another name I'd love to have here on in this corner because he, like I said, he was just a mainstay. He was always in the mix at all times. But you got a guy really in Parisyan, it seems like kind of more of a welterweight. And when you talk about just the way things were back then with the weight classes, it's fans of MMA now, especially newer fans, wouldn't even bear to think what it was like back then. I mean, you were a guy that, pretty good lightweight, but you were fighting guys that would go on to be fighting light heavyweight, middleweight, all over the place. And that's just because there were really no weight classes underneath lightweight at all. You didn't hear anything about your featherweights and your bantamweights until probably mid 2000s, really.
Right.
Talk about how it was just kind of wild out there and you just took fights, and that's kind of what it seemed like.
The early days of my career, there was no lightweight. The lightest weight class they had in the UFC was 170. And even when they did introduce 155, the weight class was only introduced to the UFC for a short period of time. Jens Pulver was the champion. Of course. He left and he went to Pride. Then the UFC got rid of the 155-pound weight class. So I fought at 170 for my entire career, and not my entire career. It was my first 37 fights. I was at 170, and I fought at 185. Yeah. And the reason being is because there was no reason for me to go to 155 because my goal was to win a UFC world title. Of course. So I had to do that at 170 because that was the lowest weight class they had. And I'm 5'6". I walk around at 175. Yeah. My walk around weight's 175. Even right now, I haven't fought in almost 10 years. I probably only weigh 178. That's just what I weigh.
Well, what did you wrestle at when you were wrestling amateur?
Oh man. The last time I competed was in high school and I wrestled 125, but that was in 1992. That was a long time ago. But, the lightest weight class the UFC had was 170, and I wanted to win a UFC world title. So I fought at 170, and I was giving up a significant amount of height and reach and weight to everybody I fought. But my game was an inside game. It was a tight game. It was a ground game. So I felt like my body style and my height and my power actually really benefited me more than helped me. I used to like fighting tall guys, and the reason why I said is because they have such long legs. Of course. And it's going to be a lot harder for them to sprawl on somebody like me with a low, fast, explosive shot. They're going to have a hard time sprawling on somebody like myself unless they lower their stance like Diaz did. If you ever watch that fight, you see him come out. He lowers his stance significantly. when he fought me. And again, we talked after the fight, and he says the reason why he did that was because he didn't want me to shoot. And then he also said, I had no idea you knew how to box. So I was able to catch him a little bit off guard. He lowered his stance. He made boxing a little more cleaner for me because he's a big boy too.
Yeah.
And it actually worked out to my benefit, I thought.
Well, now let's just play hypothetical here, but say you started MMA, you know, maybe now or 3 years ago, with the way that the divisions are now, where it's all carved out. Where do you think you would have been fighting realistically? Would you be feather or light? Do you think that's where you'd be at?
The lowest I could go was 155. For me to cut to 155, it took a lot to do that because I don't have a lot of body fat. There's not a whole lot to shave off. So, you know, everything's water weight, and I would do that cut within about 4 days. I'd call it a yo-yo effect. I'd bounce down and bounce back up. So I'd bounce down, hit 55 just for the weigh-ins, then I'd bounce back up, and I was back up to 175 by the time I fought again. That's what I call the yo-yo effect. So I
call that something else. I call that horrendous.
Get lower than that, though. I couldn't get lower than that. And, you know, I think the guys, I mean, my last fight I had was against Evan Dunham. I mean, he was 6 foot tall. Yeah. He was coming down from who knows what, 180, 185. He's a big fellow, you know, and he's fighting at 155. So when I first started fighting at 155, the first guy I fought was Kenny Florian at 155. The last 2 guys I fought at 170 were Diaz and St. Pierre.
Yeah.
You know, so when I cut to 55 and I fought Florian, you know, a 55 pounder, I mean, that was great. I'm like, this feels so different to grab onto a 155 pounder than it does to grab onto a guy coming down from 200. But eventually, you know, things have changed. So there's a lot, you know, there's bigger guys coming down to 155 now. Like I said, you know, with Dunham, you know, he was a big 55 pounder, and I'm sure there's plenty of those guys at 55 now.
Of course. Well, I'm of the mindset, you know, and you've been in the game a lot longer than I have, but I've been in the game probably about 10 straight years, and I've called a lot of fights, and I see guys and they feel like they have to do the cut, you know, to be taller, to have the reach, but then they give up a lot of that power. They give up a lot of their speed and some of the things that make them the fighter that they are. What's your mindset on that? And it doesn't even have to be just with fighting, but even with wrestling as well. It seems like there is an advantage to not having to cut so much, being more comfortable, having more speed. And you kind of fought your career basically that way, and you were successful doing it. What's your mindset on that when guys feel like they have to make that cut and they have to go 2 weight classes lower than what they walk around at?
You know, it's kind of a catch-22. You know, I mean, again, when I was competing, when I was cutting to 55, I would have anywhere from 30 to 35 hours to recover from weigh-in until the time that I stepped into the octagon. I'd have anywhere from 30 to 35 hours to recover to make sure I'm close to 100% as I could be. And I was never 100% because you can't recover from a weight cut that fast. So I wasn't 100%, but the goal was to get as close to 100% as I could. So I mean, it just depends on the person. I don't know how much time they're allowing these fighters now to recover after weigh-ins. I don't know.
Yeah.
I've read different things that certain commissions are making you stay within the certain amount of weight, you know, coming into the fight, and they only allow you to gain so much weight after the fight. There's certain commissions that are doing that. Exactly. I really don't follow the sport a whole lot anymore, so I don't know the ins and the outs of the game like I used to. Yeah. But, you know, when I was competing, I saw benefits to both. I saw benefits when I fought at 170 because I wasn't cutting weight, and I was, you know, I would watch all the guys I was competing against cut a significant amount of weight, and they were going through at 170 what I was going through at 155, and I was coming in there at 170 fresh. I mean, I was eating breakfast the morning of the weigh-ins.
Exactly.
You know, I wasn't cutting any weight at all, but then again, you know, come fight day, I was probably giving up 15 to 20 pounds. But I felt strong and I felt completely energized, and I was 100%. Whereas when I was at 55, I didn't quite feel that way. But I felt like my style changed a little bit. When I was at 55, I felt like I actually had more speed. I had more, felt like my endurance was a little bit better. I was more agile because I just was carrying a little bit less weight. Whereas when I was at 170, I felt a little more beefy and maybe not quite as agile as I was. So there's positives and negatives to both, I believe, and it really just depends on the person.
Yeah, and I honestly I applaud the commissions that are pushing it, because I think the more that we lean towards healthier cuts and guys fighting a little bit closer to the weight, I think is probably better overall. I mean, you hate to see people get, do damage to their internal organs, everything that comes with a weight cut. It's just it's a crazy thing. I've sat there and I've watched guys, do cuts that are just absolutely insane, 20 pounds in a day. I mean, I've sat there and watched it happen, and it's kind of hard to watch. You know what I mean? You definitely appreciate the fighters and how tough they are, but at the same time, you just hate to see people get seriously injured because of a weight cut. So I feel like if we can somehow maybe change that narrative and make it to where it's okay to fight closer to your weight, but I guess there's always going to be guys that are going to test those limits.
Well, every commission's going to be different too. So unless they make it like a national or international thing where every commission follows those same guidelines, you're still going to have guys who learn how to play the game, whether it be the cut in the one day or lengthening the cut out. So what I always did to help me a lot was I always did a pre-cut 4 weeks before every fight. I did a pre-cut. So I would go from my 175, I drop down to 55 for a day. Then I would put the weight back on. I would train the next morning just as if it was a fight. I'd have a bunch of guys come in there and, kind of a mock weight cut and a mock fight. And that helped me significantly, because then the next weight cut I had was 4 weeks later. My body was a lot more acclimated to it. I was able to make the cut easier. I was able to rebound faster. I was able to recover faster. And so that helped tremendously for that was just part of my stuff that I did.
Well, I want to skip ahead here, because I find this happens to me in a lot of interviews. I definitely take side roads here, and I end up getting completely off topic, but enjoying the conversation. I love digging deep into stuff like that. And that's the first time I think we've talked about weight cuts on this show, and we've done quite a few episodes, and I do appreciate it. That being said, the big moments, obviously, the first title opportunity against Matt Hughes, you come up short, but you have a great performance in that one. Pick up a couple of rounds against Hughes, who just was an absolute animal back then. I mean, that guy, he was the guy. What were your nerves like for that fight? Obviously you didn't get the win, but just kind of reflect on that one.
Yeah. I mean, not a whole lot of people gave me a chance to win that one. Matt Hughes, I believe he was number one in the world pound for pound.
Sure.
Had defended that belt several times without anybody even so much as coming close to giving him a run. So, I was a pretty big underdog going into that one. I believed I could win that fight. I trained my butt off coming into that fight. I trained harder than I never trained before, with one goal in mind, was to win that fight. So I came up short, obviously, but I was able to showcase some pretty good stuff during the course of that fight. I believe I was one of the first guys in the UFC to take Matt Hughes down and actually get him in jeopardy. And I saw the look in his eyes when I took him down, and he didn't look comfortable, which made me happy, of course. But, so I was able to showcase some good stuff in that fight. Came up short, obviously, but I think the fans I earned a lot of respect from the fans and from the UFC.
Yeah, most definitely. And, there was this kind of a big break in between there where you went off to Pride and did a few Pride fights. Obviously, everybody has their experiences being over in Japan. Was it pretty favorable to you? Because I saw that maybe you didn't really like the travel. You didn't like having to do all the travel and everything that goes with that. Overall, though, kind of sum up that experience with Pride.
Well, what happened was 2 weeks after I fought Matt Hughes, I was undefeated when I fought Hughes. I was 22-0. A lot of people don't know. I believe that's the second longest undefeated streak in the history of the sport. The Eagles got the number one. But anyway, I was undefeated coming into that fight. Matt Hughes handed me my first loss, and the UFC cut me about 2 weeks later. So I went from fighting in the UFC main event, competing for a world title.
Wow.
And months later, I was fighting inside of a horse barn at a state fair. So it was quite the fall from grace.
You know what? Hold on. Let's stop. Let's stop. That blows my mind. It reminds me so much of John Fitch, because the same thing happened to John Fitch, right? I mean, the guy was undefeated.
Yeah.
He loses his fight, and they're ready to part ways immediately.
Right.
You had to be mildly disgusted at that situation. I mean,
I
what was your mindset like? Because that just doesn't even seem possible. I mean, I know you had a certain way of fighting, and people want to, trash the wrestling style, and you know what I mean. But at the same time, it's mixed martial arts, right? I mean, it is
Right.
what it is. You do what you got to do to win, and then you get cut after 22 straight wins.
Right.
That's crazy.
Well, yeah. I mean,
what's in your mind? What's going through your mind right then?
It was a tough pill to swallow, because
Of course it was.
after I fought Matt Hughes, I was number 2 or number 3 in the world. 22 wins, 1 loss on my record, 3-1 in the UFC. I just went 5 rounds with somebody who was considered unbeatable.
Sure.
I was planning on fighting the best guys in the world. I was looking forward to fighting Carlos Newton, Frank Trigg, the guys in the top 10. Those are the guys who I was expecting to fight. And so I got the phone call 2 weeks later. I'm expecting to hear exciting news. You're fighting so-and-so, and, we'll get you right back on track. And I'm told that the UFC wants to cut me, and they're gonna get rid of my contract. And now I'm a free agent. Well, at that point in time, there was only 2 shows in town that you could actually fight and make a living in, and it was the UFC and Pride were the only shows in town.
Of course.
So basically, when that happened, I didn't sit around and pout. I didn't cry about it. It sucked, but the goal was to. That's what I told my manager. I said, I'm going to fight every month. And I said, I'm going to keep winning, and eventually they're not going to be able to turn their back on me anymore, which is what happened. So I believe I had like 10 fights over the course of a year.
Wow.
Won them all, won all of them.
Man.
And I think only one of those went to a decision over the course of the year. And one of them was in Pride, and that did go to a decision. So, the same thing happened with Pride. When I fought over in Pride, they gave me a 1-fight contract. And they brought me over there to fight the King of Rings. Ryoki Uyama was the guy I fought over there, tough guy. And, I beat him handedly, put a clinic. And then after the fight was over, and it wasn't a boring fight. If you ever watched that fight, it wasn't a boring fight. There was a lot of stuff going on. There was a lot of jiu-jitsu, a lot of good wrestling, a lot of good slams, and ground and pound and stuff like that. So it wasn't a boring fight by any means. And I was expecting to hear back from Pride and have them tell me, hey, we want to give you a 3-fight contract, but that wasn't the case. They didn't want to sign me again. So they had Ryoki Uyama back in the next event, but they didn't have me back. So it just was a tough pill to swallow, and eventually that's what ended up having. I ended up walking away from the sport for a year, started a hardwood floor company just because I wasn't able to make a living as a fighter fighting in small shows. Couldn't get any top 10 guys to fight me outside the UFC.
Exactly. That's tough too. Yeah, just trying to find a fight.
Back in those days, you couldn't do that, because one loss will set you back years as far as getting into the UFC. So finding a top 10 guy to fight you outside the UFC is next to impossible. Once you get into the UFC, they're all over the place and they'll fight you on a day's notice. But outside the UFC, that's not the case. So UFC cut me. Pride didn't want me back. Couldn't get any top 10 guys. Couldn't make a living in the small shows. So I ended up retiring. I didn't retire. I walked away from the sport for a year, started a hardwood floor company, and that's what happened.
Yeah. Well, you come back obviously, and we know the story. You come through and you beat Kenny Florian. You win the championship. Has to be an incredible moment in your life, man. Because that's what you talked about early on in this interview, was that was the goal. You want to be the world champion. You became the world champion. What sort of feelings, what kind of flood of feelings was going on at that point when you actually made that happen against all odds there, and all the setbacks, et cetera, and you come through and you win that title?
Yeah, I mean, that was probably one of the highlights that was the highlight of my career, and probably one of the biggest highlights of my life, because that's something that had been 7.5 years as a mixed martial artist. I had 35 professional fights, 34 wins, 1 loss, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to win a world title. And, how that fight came about was the UFC brought the 155-pound division back. I was fighting at 170. Yes. I just got done fighting Nick Diaz, and I beat him by decision. And then I got a phone call a couple weeks after that fight. And, Monty Cox was my manager, and he says, the UFC wants to know if you can make 155. And I said, well, yeah, why? I said, because if you can make 155, they will let you fight for the reinstated 155-pound title. And I said, yeah, I can make 55.
Of course.
He says,
yeah,
have you done it before? He says, have you done it before? I said, no, but I'll make it. Believe me, I'll make it. So that's where the whole trial cut came in. And my first trial cut was a month before the fight, and I didn't make it the first time around. I got down to about 158, and that was it. My body shut down, and that was it. And that's why I did the trial cut, was, to get that out of the way right away. And then, then the real cut came for fight time, and it was a lot easier. But so they reinstated the 155-pound division. They allowed me to fight for the belt, and then I won the world title. So it was a life-changing event. Significantly life-changing event.
Yeah, and props on it, man. Awesome. I kind of remember when it all went down, and I'd be remiss if we don't cover what happened next. Obviously, you beat Hermes Franca. They stripped the title because of steroids, PEDs. Man, I haven't heard a lot of interviews from you just in a while. What can you walk me through the whole situation, kind of how it all went down? Because I feel like you had such a, as we've been talking about your story, and I think it's an awesome story. You have an awesome story, and I think you're kind of one of the champions that they don't want to recognize as much. And because of what happened with the steroids, can you just kind of walk me through the situation, how it all went down, and if there's anything that you need to set straight, that maybe there's misinformation out there or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this in detail several times, many times throughout the course of the last 10 years. Well, that was like 13 years ago, but I've talked about it a lot. And so what they accused me of taking was nandrolone, which is, I think it's a testosterone booster. It's like, it makes you gain weight, it makes you gain muscle. And that was part of the reason why I tried to explain to them, like, why would I, I got to cut 25 pounds. Why would I be taking something like that? But besides that, that's sure. Neither here nor there. But so they accused me of taking this, and so the first thing was I didn't take it, obviously, and I told them that many times. They weren't willing to listen, so I had to go to the it was a commission hearing. So I went to the commission hearing and passed several polygraph examinations. I passed several blood tests to show that obviously I wasn't lying about not taking it, and there was nothing in my blood. There was something in my urine. It was 12 nanograms or something like that. And a natural athlete can get as many as 9. So It wasn't significantly high, but I don't know. I mean, I thought I had done plenty enough proof to prove that I hadn't taken anything, but they just weren't willing to listen. And instead of instating me I was suspended for a year, they reinstated me after 6 months. They weren't willing to admit that they were wrong, but they were willing.
Tough for anybody, right? Yeah.
They were willing to at least reduce my sentence. But that being said, probably about 6 months after that took place, Quest Laboratories is the laboratories that took my sample and tested my sample. And there was a big, long chain of custody that took place that was all out of whack. And there was actually proof that they showed, documented on paper, that there was actually contamination in the machine that they tested my sample before they even tested my sample. And that was on paper. So the commission's excuse was there's no proof that was nandrolone, but there was something in there and we don't know what it was. Well, obviously you shouldn't have even tested my sample if that was the case, but they tested it anyway. So about 6 months after that took place, California got rid of Quest Laboratories, so they no longer use them, which was proof to me in my mind that they obviously did something wrong. And I believe it was within about 9 months after that happened, the head commissioner, Armando Garcia, was the head California commissioner at that time. He actually got fired for embezzling money and several sexual harassment charges. Oh, wow. So that just goes to show like the character of the guy who accused me of taking that stuff and just refused to listen to the fact that, the polygraphs, 3 of them. I mean, to me, that's proof enough. And the blood tests, because blood tests are much more accurate than urinalysis are.
Yeah, 100%. But once you get branded something, then it takes over, right? I mean, it's, right. even if you run every piece of paper and proof and you got 15 different doctors, it doesn't matter in the court of public opinion. And I feel like that kind of happened to you. What do you think about that? I mean, do you feel like you've been kind of dealt a bad hand in that sort of situation? You don't seem like a guy that's going to dwell on something like that, but at the same time, do you feel like that was kind of an unfair thing that maybe has loomed a little bit?
Yeah, it was really unfair. And from a fan standpoint, I get it because they weren't involved with what took place. They don't know what was taking place behind closed doors, and they're just going by whatever they hear in the media. So I understand. I didn't take it to heart as far as that goes, even though I got booed on stage for quite a while after that. I just use that as motivation. But yeah, I mean, it's not a good thing to be branded with because I lost all of my supplement sponsors for years. Yes. It took me probably 3 or 4 years after that to actually get myself a supplement sponsor. And with the way I train and the way my body type is and how good my cardio is and everything that how I present myself, I feel like I should have had a lot of really big, high name supplement sponsors, but I couldn't get a supplement company to touch me for the life of me. Yeah, and, I mean, the thing is, when this was all taking place, Dana White was involved with this, and they actually sent a representative to the commission hearing. I had 2 different hearings. So the first commission hearing I had, the UFC sent a representative there because they wanted to see what was taking place. I was the champion. They wanted to see what was taking place. They wanted to know what's going on. And I talked to Dana several times throughout this. I told him about the polygraphs and the blood tests and all that stuff. And he told me, he said, Sean, I believe you. He says, I believe you didn't take it. He goes, but if they accuse you of taking this, he says, we're going to have to take the belt. And the reason why is because, other people have been accused of taking this in the past. And there's going to be guys who get accused of taking stuff, PEDs, in the future. Says we have to take the belt. That's just standard practice. It's just how it is. And I agreed with him. And he said, the thing is, if we take your belt, he says, you're going to be the first one to get the fight for the belt against the new champion. And the new champion was BJ Penn. So that's how that fight with BJ came about.
Yeah, of course. Well, Sean, and we could talk forever, and I like talking to you, and there's a lot more that I'd love to talk with you about. However, I got time constraints, unfortunately, but I would love, to reconnect and do this again, and and talk about your thoughts on. I know you say you don't follow it much, but obviously, all the big names of what's going on and how wild things are now and how different they are from your era. So I would love to dive in deep and do that again. But until then, we'll sign off for now. And I just want to thank you for coming on the show and allowing us to kind of go into some of this. It's great.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks a lot. Appreciate
Absolutely. That is the Muscle Shark. That is Sean Sherk. And that was good stuff. Riveting television here on In This Corner. And hopefully we'll get Sean back very, very soon. That being said, that does it for us on this episode. And follow us on all of our social media. We'll see you next time. Cyrus Fees on In This Corner.